Hello everyone, my name is Rashel Bernal and today I will be presenting on the topic of combating ableism in schools and integrating special education students. At this time, I'd like to present Fred Buglioni, who is the CEO and president of the New Jersey Coalition of Inclusive Education. I would also like to thank Mr. Buglioni for his interest in combating ableism in New Jersey schools. This is the overview of the presentation or what's in store, and I will break down this presentation in the problem, ableism in schools, specific learning disabilities, special education, long-term effects, plan of action, and a sort of budget. What is the big issue? Well, the problem is that besides the great amount of students who are placed into special education and overall forms of ableism that are presented in schools, the major problem is the misidentification of students with disabilities, right? And besides the incredible number, like these students again are giving limitations, they're misidentified, and the big problem with this is that a lot of the time they're misidentified and it leads them to certain things like they take fewer challenging courses because they feel so limited, right, in what they can do. They have lower graduation rates and they attend college at lower levels because again they're presented with the stigma that they can't do as much as a person who's labeled as normal or general education, and these multitude of limitations placed on these children have such an issue and it runs for them throughout their lives, which I have a diagram showing this later on throughout the presentation. And again, a large problem of this is also exclusion, the isolation of students. Like, why, after they're placed into special education, which is supposed to help them, they're isolated, which wouldn't help anybody, right? For the most part, and due to the federal mandate, like they have to stay in these like special education classrooms for a great majority of their school career, and it's usually not helpful, like I've repeated multiple times, and that is the major problem for this. The major problem is the idea that students can just be identified based on how they look or how teachers may see them, and a lot of the time this can lead to major problems in students lifetime long term. One of the most important topics in my presentation is ableism, more specifically ableism in schools. And ableism in schools can be defined as the discrimination and exclusion of disabled students by their non-disabled classmates and teachers. Um, as referred by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, many students are being refer to special education primarily because of their disability as opposed to their academic performance. And that's generally how students are chosen to be into special education. And it would be a violation of rights to just put students into special education because they look disabled or they should be. And that's just not the case, right? It's more of a beliefs. Ableism are beliefs against against people, and this like these thoughts that you have preconceived notions of a group of people and how they look like and what they should look like. And a lot of the time, um, many forms of ableism are unintentional, right? They're more like they seem to be helpful, and there is an author who has broken down certain categories of ableism and how they're presented by certain school personnel and teachers at schools. And for the first one, there are three categories, which is pity ableism, horror story ableism, and gatekeeper ableism. The first one, which is petty ableism, is more like a petty ableist acknowledges that the disability is quote unquote big and scary, right? And it's also life changing. This person acknowledges that someone else is disabled and faces it with pittiness and sadness. For example, the pity ableist is the kind of person who rushes to aid a person using a wheelchair without even asking if the person needs a wheelchair, right? Again, it's a belief. Like, I think you need help. I'm not going to ask you if you need help, but I'm going to walk up to you and give you a resource I think you need when you never asked me for it. And that's very subtle, but very much real. The next one is the horror story ableism, or also known as like campfire horror story. Like this person again is another group of ableists who want to show you that, like, being disabled is scary, horrible, um, and they establish being disabled as a problem for that parents want to avoid. They encourage the fear of using diagnostic tools in the school system. So, and then this causes parents to avoid asking for accommodations out of the fear of being labeled, as a fear of their child being labeled. Also, they tend to create a hierarchy in which some disabilities are considered better and which ones are considered worst. And they usually do this in order to scare people into not wanting their child to be diagnosed in the school system, because it costs money to diagnose students. And for that reason, it's called horror, because they plant this fear in parents that's like, your child doesn't need to be labeled, you don't need to do any of this, because it would just lead to the stigma we want to avoid, right? And the last one is gatekeeper ableism. So gatekeeper ableists are people that tend to keep the resources to themselves, right? Gatekeepers, like they don't want to show anyone else what they have. And for the most part, like they can be defined as the person keeping the gate who could provide the accommodation, but just doesn't. And they do this, for example, as like the gatekeeper ableist um, might tell you that a child who cannot use a toilet independently cannot attend school. And this sounds bad, and it is bad, because they rather not help this child with their resources if they don't want to, right? They rather put in these crazy limitations in order to stop a child from using their resources. And I think, to me, it's like one of the worst kind of ableists, because it's intentional, right? It's really intentional. Like, I know your child needs this help, but I'm not going to help them because I'd rather not use my resources. Like, don't label them, don't have them diagnosed, and the problem is gone. It's very scary that that's a reality that some children may face in their schools, and it is. I'd like to briefly touch on specific learning disabilities, as can be seen by this 2015-2016 chart in New Jersey. New Jersey has a large percentage of students who are labeled as under the specific learning of disabilities, right? A lot of them deal with a lot of issues and being taken seriously for their certain disability that prevents them from doing certain things in classrooms. A lot of them can be dyslexia, which is very common, or a lot of processing disorders. But these students are smart and they're capable, and they're often put into these isolated classrooms that undermine their academic and social potential. And a lot of the time, students are looked over because they do not fit the image of someone with a disability, right? Students who have specific learning disabilities also shouldn't just be placed into special ed as the first and only option, but it should only be if it's the best option. The next topic is on special education. New Jersey is number one in the nation when it comes to isolating students with special needs in self-contained classrooms for much of the day, and in public and private special education schools. Even though right now I'm focusing on the public school aspect, it's still very prevalent, a pretty prevalent statement. And with that being said, there's a lot of assumptions tied to the word like tied to the word special education. Um, Two of those assumptions are that one, disability is deviant and should be eradicated, right? And the next one is that all special services should be delivered in a separate environment, which just leads to the main problem, which is the exclusion, right, to begin with, of students who are in special education. In like similar articles, there's talk of some teachers who see it as a privilege for students with disabilities to be included with their peers in general education classrooms. Because of this belief, teachers absolve themselves from feeling responsible for educating students with disabilities. And they think that these students can only be educated in like resource rooms. And a lot of the time, people may say that students who go into special education are helped, right? But to what extent? If they're being isolated, they're not being helped socially. Majority of the time, they're just being put into a room of isolation, but without any more of the extra help because they think that with isolating, they would be able to focus more. And all the time, again, like because of certain federal mandates, students who go into special education at a young age stay in special education for the rest of their school careers, which leads to, again, just feeling this constant isolation in schools. And a lot of the time, like these students never go back into education. Like statistically speaking, only 5% of students are able to reintegrate into general education, and it just really puts things into perspective. A lot of the times people may think that, oh, if you put a student into special education, there really isn't no harm. But is there really no harm, no foul? That is not true. And a lot of the time, like these sorts of ableist beliefs don't just put, like, the teachers are not the only people who put these students into special education, or like into these roles, but also parents are part of this ableism. Since there is a bad stigma attached to like the term special education, parents rather their child not be labeled at all, and therefore they do not provide the assistance a child would need. Only 56% of the time do parents follow the recommendation of children being evaluated for special education services. Um, Overall, this isn't about the problem with being put into special education. It's being able to see if the child is in need of any services whatsoever, if there is any like lingering learning disability that needs to be put into the light to help this child further their educational goals. One thing I really want to emphasize in this proposal is the long-term effects, or what happens when these children who are placed into these special education classrooms and deprived from social interactions, and they're given these limitations that make them feel like they're limited, right? What happens to them and why should we care? And for the most part, I like to make a great emphasis on how great it is investing in children, right? Especially the children of New Jersey where we live, right? These children need someone to believe in them, someone to help them believe that they're not limited in certain aspects because they've been told to, that they are. And investing in children is so important because one day they're in elementary school, right? And they're told that they can't do this and they can't do that. And now they live their whole lives thinking they are so academically challenged to the point where they no longer can do their own work on their own, and they need constant reassurance and help. And at the end of the day, they aren't unable to, I want to say, may I dare say, like function properly in society independently. And a lot of the time, it could have been avoided if these stigmas and limitations weren't instilled in them that they couldn't do certain things. And again, like there's stigmas behind that follow them their whole lives, which is being academically challenged or not being good enough as a normal student or general ed student. And I decided to include a chart right next to it, which was what happens generally to students and the percentages that happens at. And for the most part, right, individual with disabilities 64% do not live independently, 40% are not financially independent, 30% are unemployed, 15% remain unengaged in the community, and 45% do not pursue post-secondary training or education. And again, that emphasis of unengaged in the community, if we invest in the children of today and give them the room where they can grow academically and their foundation of education is grown in elementary school where they can be socially active, they will become the people who will help New Jersey and be involved in this community as much as possible because they are the foundation of New Jersey in the future. My plan of action, again, lies within practices that should be reinforced within school personnel, students, and parents. But also, again, as the problem states, there is a lot of misidentification with students and who really belongs in special education or who actually has a disability and not just is bad at one subject, right? Just like anyone else. And a lot of this can be determined by a RTI or response to intervention, which New Jersey does use as presented in this little chart. It uses many forms of interventions in order to see what kind of help or intervention a student needs. And to be more specific, an RTI distinguishes if students are accurately being placed into special education. It's the approach, support, and early identify and provide support for students with certain needs. And I think that being able to bring this back and put more emphasis on this further on provides good foundation for students in elementary school, and for students in order to provide a good framework in their learning for the future, right? And just being able to use such a tool or maybe fix this tool and make it better in order to actually accurately identify students and not just, I guess, quote unquote, not diagnose, but assume someone has a learning disability or is unable to do certain schoolwork just because it's a feeling and not an accurate placement. I have yet to come up with a monetary value for this budget because for my proposal, I propose a lot of practices. For example, the training of teachers and school personnel and the practices of distributing leadership amongst themselves and not just relying on special education teachers to help with students who have certain disabilities. Everyone should be able to contribute equally. This also comes hand in hand with creating a more inclusive curriculum. This enables both general and special education teachers to work together and create a more inclusive curriculum and environment for students to learn in. A lot of this can be proven or emphasized through studies that have proven that when students are when both general and special education students are placed in the same room and teachers are able to collaborate with them effectively by making a curriculum that doesn't single out a single student, and it makes it so much easier and so much better socially and educationally for both students to understand what it really means to be in an inclusive classroom. And to emphasize the issue with this is that only 17% of general education teachers feel very well prepared to teach children with mild to moderate learning disabilities, and only 30% feel strongly about their preparedness, according to the National Center for Learning Disabilities. I would like to conclude this presentation by saying that practices help promote inclusivity more than programs do. And I say this not lightly because there have been one and one again more programs that quote unquote promote inclusivity, but it doesn't work right as well as we want it to. And it's because programs are not the solution. There cannot be a good program without the intended good practices that come with it. For example, you can't expect people not to be ableist if you don't teach them about ableism and how ableism is harmful, right? So there are just so many practices that could be instilled in these children, and not just children themselves, but teachers, taking away this connotation that certain students are better than others and some students are just slower and we need to slow down and isolate them so it helps them, but that's just not the case. Just so many forms of discrimination that could be avoided with constant practices, with more practices, and students being the primary people who benefit from it, right? Um, and and with the ability of instilling these practices in children and school personnel, we'd be able to stop so much ableism from occurring in our schools and causing children to suffer for lifetime of education and present it later on. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening. And if there's any questions, I can take them and you can reach me at this email. Thank you so much.